Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo. And specifically, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to leverage a function that we wrote in an earlier video and leverage a little bit of logic based on our command line arguments to be able to selectively call that function. If you've watched the earlier video on how to create the GetInfo function, you'll know that we're basically stuck with simply calling it inside of our main. We really have no control over when it gets called. And we can quickly see that as we add more functions, then that would become a little bit difficult or a little bit ornery, I guess you could say, to be able to constantly turn on and off functions. Instead, what we want to do is we want to be able to leverage our command line arguments combined with a little bit of logic to be able to selectively call our GetInfo and then ultimately add many, many, many more functions to our public class fundamentals demo, or perhaps elsewhere in other classes. And so to begin with, what we want to do is remind ourselves of our ability to collect the arguments from the command line. And if you recall, in Java, Java does not have the name of the main class being a command line argument. So basically, if nothing is passed after the class that is passed to the Java runtime, then your arg count will be 0. And so unlike in C, where the executable is included in the list, in Java, it is not. And so therefore, if we have 0 arguments, that means that there is nothing to be handled in our logic. And if we pass an argument, then we want to be able to triage that argument and the second argument and so on. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to pass an argument that indicates to our code that we wish to run our fundamentals.demo.getInfo, rather than simply hard coding it. So we'll start off here, just making a couple of notes here. We want to be able to selectively run code. Well, if we selectively run code, that already indicates some sort of if structure or the equivalent. And specifically what we want to do is we want to be able to run our GetInfo as well as other functions, which we have yet to write. But then we also want to be able to run our help, or provide the user with some help or some feedback on how our executable actually works. So very, very similar, if you would, to some of the other videos in the 233 fundamentals demo series. So to begin with, let's go ahead and look at how we would write our logic and where we would leverage our command line arguments. Your first guess, and it wouldn't necessarily be wrong, would be that somewhere in the Java framework, there is going to be some capability of comparing strings. And so the first place that we would look is going to be under java.lang.string. And yes, while that is where the class resides, if you were to look at the static functions associated with the string class, in other words, functions that do not need an instance of a string, you would see potentially some options. However, though, there is another way to go about doing this. And we want to be a little bit careful because we're still not quite yet ready to deal with objects. But what we want to do is we want to think in terms of an instance of something. And so these static methods right here don't require an instance of a string, but rather in Java, what we need to do is we need to compare an existing string to another string. In order to be able to do that, then we want to leverage our arguments array. And so we'll see in just a second how to go about doing that. But first, what we want to do is we want to think in terms of what combination of logic would we actually need. Well, we're going to keep this one simple. The whole goal is to be able to pass a switch that indicates that we want to call our GetInfo function. And so a logical switch to do this would simply be /GetInfo. And then also for our help, probably some logical combinations would be /h, /help for that matter, or /, or some unhandled combination. But no matter what, we want to have at least one argument be passed to our Java code. And so what you'll see is to keep the structure of our logic fairly simple. We're going to use just a flat structure to begin with, and a if statement followed by an else if, and so on. And so to begin with, what we'll do here is we will look at the scenario in which our args.length is equal to 0. In other words, the user did not provide any additional argument. They just tried to run your Java main class, in which case we want to call help. And implicitly, because basically we're not specifically asking the user to know which switches call for help, they just don't know what they are doing. And so at this point, then it's just going to be an implicit call for help. And then what we want to do is we want to handle then an else if statement where the user did provide an argument. So in other words, our args.length is going to be equal to 1. And this is where we're actually going to leverage then the arguments array itself, and we're going to look at the 0th argument. Remember, again, that Java is 0-based. And then when I do the dot notation on args square bracket 0, in other words, we're not looking at the array of strings, but rather the specific instance or the 0th string in the arguments array, you'll see that we get another set of options. These are the instance methods. In other words, it means that you have to have a valid instance of a string to be able to use these functions. And so you can see I have a slightly different set of options, and specifically the ones that we want to take a look at are things like the equals ignore case. We could perhaps leverage the is blank and is empty. Starts with can be beneficial as well. We can look at other ones as we go along, and you'll see there's quite a few more options. And so we have a couple of them, the compare to, ignore case. Those return an integer value, but you probably want to take a look at this equals ignore case because it is a Boolean. Now, I would encourage you to take a look at the Java help for the strings. We'll take a look at it both interactively as well as online, and I'll provide you with a link to the online version of the JDK for this particular class. But this probably makes the most sense, and you'll notice that it accepts another string as an input argument. So the idea is that we want to compare our argument square bracket 0. We want to ignore the case, and specifically what we want to do is we want to make sure or see that it matches /GetInfo. And in this case, then we want to see that it is true. In other words, do those two match? And at this point, then it's just a matter of making sure that all of your parentheses line up. I missed one on accident here. And then our curly braces line up. And then what do we want to have happen when the argument 0 matches our GetInfo? Well, what we can do is we can just simply move this code up here, and we want to be able to call our GetInfo function. Now, you can continue on with this else if logic. We said we wanted to handle a /h, perhaps even a /help or /?. You've got a couple of different ways that you can do this. You can do this as 3 separate lines, or you could combine the logic using an or. And just for a little bit of variety, let's go ahead and look at how we would do this if our arguments.length was equal to 1, and then one of 3 possibilities. And so we're going to again use a set of nested parentheses, an additional set. And this may end up getting a little bit long here, and we'll see. We may just bring the code over to the next line. But what we want to do is we want to look at our args square bracket 0 dot, and then our equals ignore case again. And if it looks like it matches the /h, or, and what we'll do here is we will do a little bit of selective copying and pasting here because it can speed this up. If it's equal to /h, if it's equal to /help, or if it's equal to /?, And assuming that I've got my curly braces and my parentheses lined up correctly, which it appears that I do not. Once again, let's see if we can match this up. I have been a little too ambitious here with my parentheses. All right, those two match up. You can see where they're highlighted. This one matches up. This one. All right, I seem to have accidentally mismatched my parentheses. There we go. There's our problem. And there we go. Once again, sometimes the ID is helpful. Sometimes it doesn't quite get it right. But more importantly, when the length is 1 and any of these three conditions are true, we want to make an explicit call for help. And what does that mean? It just simply means that the user did, in fact, intend to call your help function. Now, here is where this gets a little bit complicated. We could, for instance, limit this to args.length equal to 1, or we could look at it as any argument count greater than 0, where the arg0 was equal to either /h/help or /?. There's several different scenarios that we can handle here. As a matter of fact, you would almost argue that this could probably be our first else if, even before we start getting into our functions. But more importantly, then what we want to do is we want to follow all of this up with an implicit call for help, meaning that the user somehow passed a switch combination that we did not anticipate. Well, the last part of this then is to actually call the help. And we could, of course, write the help inside of each one of the branches of our if-else if statement, but that would lead to some redundant code. Instead, what we want to do is simply match the pattern that we've already established with our GetInfo, in that we simply create a public static void, and we will simply call it help. And you can refer to some of my earlier videos about some suggestions on what this should look like. We'll keep this one pretty straightforward. We're going to have print line, and we're going to have something like a usage, and then system.out print line. And then here is where you can specify /h/?, or /help. And then this will simply call the help. And I'm going to give us a little bit of room to work here. And then we have also system.out print line. And another switch combination would be the GetInfo. And this just simply calls GetInfo function. And you can be as elaborate in your description as you'd like to be. Ultimately, it helps the user in understanding what your application does. At this point, now that we have our little helper function written, we simply want to go back to our code, call help implicitly, call help explicitly, and then ultimately call help. Now, we got a couple of options here. Again, we can simply use the function itself, or if we want to be specific about which help we are calling, we specify the package name, class name, and the static function name. And as I mentioned in the earlier videos, would encourage you to go ahead and use the full path for now, especially when you're first learning about the Java language and the framework and the syntax. At this point, then, it looks like we may have some errors, but let's go ahead and build it. Let's see what we've got. Nope, looks like we took care of all of them. Those were probably just a little bit of legacy from those mismatched parentheses. But at this point now, hopefully you understand or can see that if we pass 0 arguments, we should get an implicit call to help. If we pass 1 argument and it happens to be any of those 3, then we should get an explicit call for help. The user is not really going to know the difference between those two. It's just handled differently in code. And then if we pass the /GetInfo, we should get the function GetInfo called. And then likewise, if there's some combination that we didn't expect, well, then we should once again provide the user some help. So let's see how we did. So we'll first start off with no switches. And sure enough, we get our help. We're going to have a little bit of fun with this. I'm just going to call it with some silly argument, Bob. Sure enough, we get help. We have our /? We get help. /H, sure enough, gets help. And then /HELP also gets help. And now for the grand finale, we don't have any mistakes in our logic. When we pass the /GetInfo, we should now get the GetInfo function called. At this point, you should feel pretty comfortable passing at least a single argument to your command line. What I would encourage you to do at this point is, before you move on to the next video, prove to yourself that you can write a little function. Maybe it does nothing more than simply adds two things together, or only has a print statement inside of it, but that prove to yourself that you can add another command line argument to your else if logic and be able to call it successfully from the command line. We will be using this very extensively throughout this series and later series to be able to selectively call and then ultimately test your application. You'll see that there are ways that you can test a pretty sophisticated application without necessarily having to provide user input. So as always, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.